Hello and welcome. I'm Anneke Lucas and this is my podcast. And we're here in beautiful Woodstock and I have a guest today I'll tell you about in a minute. First, as usual, I want to ask you for your support. Any small donations, large donations. Obviously, I'm a small person. I'm one person. I don't have a great platform behind me, or I don't have like a big team or anything. That's because I hold on to my integrity that way. And I'm very, very grateful for the donations that I've received and continue to receive. So just anything that you have ever given, I just want to really thank you. It really helps. And I really love to be able to sit down with people. And then, of course, that requires some funding. And so very happy to be here today. And my guest is Nick Bryant. So he's sometimes I interview people that are not necessarily survivors, but that are truth speakers. And so Nick is an author. He actually wrote the Franklin Scandal, which is a really important book. And he has been a journalist forever, and he's actually the founder and director of Epstein Justice. So we'll be talking more about that. And Nick, very welcome.
It's great to be with you, Anneke.
Really nice to have you here. Thanks for coming out. And yes, I wanted to ask you, because my podcasts are usually very personal, so I did want to ask you, if you don't mind, talking a little bit about your journey, how you ended up from basically mainstream journalism and how you ended up involved in these subjects.
Should we start from the beginning, the Big Bang?
Sure.
I've had a difficult childhood, and I'd written a number of things about lower socioeconomic children in the United States. Over the course of my career, I've written about a lot of different things. My journalism career has had many incarnations. But how I got into this particular area, I was pitching stories to an editor in Manhattan, which is where I live, and he said, pitch me dark stories. So kind of Nazis, a cult, I mean, what do you want? And he said, a cult. Give me a story about the occult. So I had a simple plan, and when anybody says that they have a simple plan, you know it's going to get convoluted. So I had a simple plan. I wanted to befriend some people that were into the dark arts and maybe attend a black mass or a Gnostic mass and write an article about it, and it would be a pretty easy payday. But then, as a writer, you're looking around, you troll the internet for subjects that are tangential to what you're writing about. And I came across a US Customs report on a cult called the Finders. And there were 2 finders in Tallahassee, Florida with 6 kids, ages 2 to 6, I believe. And they were ragamuffins. The kids looked badly abused. And a couple of Tallahassee citizens called the police, and the police showed up. And these guys were dressed very nicely. And they took one look at the guys, one look at the kids. They put the kids in protective custody, and then they put the guys in jail on multiple counts of child abuse. And actually, one of the doctors said that 2 of the children had shown signs of sexual abuse. So in Washington, D.C., the police department was looking into this cult. This cult was centered in a warehouse in Washington, D.C. And the D.C. police had connected them to an unsolved homicide and also heard that they'd done very bad things with children. So U.S. Customs got involved, because wherever there's child abuse material, the U.S. Customs will get involved. So U.S. Customs got involved, and then the D.C. police got involved, and they served a search warrant on the Finders warehouse. And they found all kinds of crazy stuff. The finders were buying a couple of kids in Hong Kong, and there was what looked to be multiple examples of child abuse material, and really weird stuff. I mean, they were saving their feces, they were saving their urine, and the finders, when someone would ask or put a want ad in for a babysitter, a finder would respond and try to get intelligence on that particular family. So it was dark. And Ramon Martinez wrote the U.S. Customs report. And he was appalled, as he should be. But then he didn't hear of anything happening. And then he finally went to the DC police and said, you know, what's going on with the Finders case? And he was told by a DC police detective or officer that the Finders case had become a CIA internal matter and that there would be no more investigation. And when I came across that document, it blew me away because, well, first of all, the CIA isn't supposed to do anything domestically. I mean, not that's ever stopped them, but legally they're not supposed to. But why would the CIA go to bat for a cult that's seemingly doing various nefarious things to children? And I couldn't account for it. In the paradigm that I was operating from, I couldn't account for that document. It did not fit. And I realized that I missed something big in life if something like that happened. So that started my odyssey into large trafficking networks.
And investigating it.
Investigating, yeah.
So you actually had done work for Rolling Stone magazine. So what happened to your career?
Well, no, I pitched that story to Rolling Stone magazine. I hadn't written for them ever. I mean, I'd written for other publications, but and my career was fairly mainstream at that point.
Okay.
And I found it, well, when I started, what happened was, there was internet innuendo about another network like the Finders. And it was out of Omaha, Nebraska. There was a lot of innuendo, and I wasn't sure how much of it was true and how much of it wasn't. And there seemed to be some smoke there, but I didn't know how big the fire was. So I went to Omaha to check it out. And that was an eye-opening experience, because I ended up with a list of like 60 victims. 60 that had been abused by that particular network. And I was followed. I had a death threat. But what was even more frightening to me was we're in Middle America, and I'm talking to people about this trafficking network, the Franklin, I'll call it the Franklin Trafficking Network, and it was like I was talking to, it was like I was doing an expose about the KGB in Stalinist Russia. People were terrified to talk about this.
So people who knew anything about it were too afraid to talk.
They were terrified. And that's what really freaked me out. And then the last night I was there, I did get a death threat, and that was, I'd never had one of those before. So that was kind of a new and exciting experience.
My experience, reading your book, it just becomes really exhaustive when you describe everything, one thing after the other, after the other, after the other, that is done from the official channels to block the case, to block anything from going forward, even though the commission was, you know, the head of the commission, I forget his name now, was completely sincere, and the investigator was sincere, who then ended up dying in a plane crash, bringing a video with proof, basically, right, back to Omaha.
Okay, what happened there was Lawrence King, there were two pimps in that network, Lawrence King in Omaha, Nebraska, and Craig Spence in Washington, D.C. And King was primarily responsible for getting the kids. Although Spence had a connection to kids, but King was plundering Boys Town, the distinguished Catholic orphanage on the outskirts of Omaha. And then he was getting kids other ways too. Predators know how to get kids. They dedicate their lives to getting kids, so they know how to get kids. And he was the manager of the Franklin Credit Union. And the Franklin Credit Union was audited. It hadn't, federally insured credit unions need to be audited every year by law. And the Franklin Credit Union hadn't been audited in 4 years. And King was $40 million short. So the Nebraska Senate wanted to look into this. How did King get $40 million out of a credit union that should have had $2.5 million? So these senators, these Nebraska state senators, formed the Franklin Committee. And as they were forming the Franklin Committee, people that were part of social services went to them and said, King is a thief, but he's also trafficking children. And they started to look at that facet of the problem of King's child trafficking. And King had been reported to various law enforcement entities, but they just completely ignored everything. And so this subcommittee was really dedicated to not only finding out where the money went, but finding out if King was trafficking children. And as you mentioned, there was an amazing investigator. His name was Gary Caradori. They hired an amazing investigator. And he was finding victims and witnesses faster than the FBI could cover them up and threaten them. Because the FBI was threatening everybody. And,
because let's be clear that Lawrence King was an up-and-coming candidate in the Republican Party, and that there were connections to the White House here also, that these children were actually trafficked to the White House.
Well, one of them was given a midnight tour of the White House.
Paul Bonacci.
Paul Bonacci. And King was very high in the Republican Party. He was probably the fastest rising African American in the Republican Party. So Gary Caradori was dogged, and he pursued these leads. I mean, I was able to write the Franklin scandal because of his documentation, which had been sealed in a grand jury. But I was able to get a lot of the documents that had been sealed, a lot of the testimony that had been sealed. And Gary Caradori made contact with one of King's blackmail photographers, who was in the Southwest. And he agreed to give Caradori pictures in Chicago. So, and I've got 5 sources that say Gary Caradori got what he was looking for in Chicago. 5 sources.
He and his young boy, right? He was there with his young boy. He took his boy,
and they were going to go to the All-Star game.
Right.
And then fly back. And Rusty Nelson, I do believe, gave Gary Caradori a bunch of pictures. And that blackmail fodder. And when Gary Caradori and his son were flying back, his plane blew up over Lee County, Illinois. And he was killed, and his son was killed, and the pictures were nowhere to be found.
Because they were in a briefcase, and that briefcase was never found.
Yes. Yeah.
And as I was reading your book also, I was just really struck by the similarities of this case with the Dutroux case, because when I say exhaustive, what is exhaustive is how much is being done to get something done, and how powerful really the opposition is, and the blocking of the case is. That of course includes also people who are sincere, like in the Dutroux case, the original investigators were thrown off the case which was really an excuse to throw them off, because they were investigated as investigators. They were investigated, and that investigation into the investigators turned out to be not valid after one day. And yet these investigators they were put on leave. They were never allowed back on the case. And so similarly, other people got involved and then really blocked justice, and everything that was relevant to the case got cut off from it. And meanwhile, in the 8 years that it took for the case to go to trial, about 30 people who had physical evidence of the existence of the larger network that included, of course, the very prominent VIPs from Belgium, they were killed.
There were a number of deaths with the Franklin scandal, and mysterious deaths. Every chapter there's a mysterious death or a mysterious suicide. And what happened was there were two grand juries. There was a state grand jury and there was a federal grand jury. And they were going to investigate the Franklin trafficking network. And both of them were very, very corrupt. I don't know if your audience knows about grand juries, but grand juries are very easy to corrupt. A special prosecutor is chosen to oversee a grand jury. And grand jurors are just citizens that have shown up for jury duty. And the only evidence that's presented to them is presented by the special prosecutor. The special prosecutor chooses the evidence that's shown to the grand jurors, and he also calls the witnesses that the grand jurors will hear. And they're in grand juries have been notorious as far as being corrupt, because there was a New York Supreme Court justice that said special prosecutors of grand juries have so much power over grand jurors that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. And the two grand juries in Nebraska, the state and the federal, found that there wasn't any child trafficking, and indicted the kids that stood up to the FBI and wouldn't recant accounts of their abuse, which there were two.
Yeah, that is Alicia Owens, right?
But the grand jury in Florida.
So when you say the kids, I just wanted to make clear the victims.
Yeah,
the victims were indicted, and can you just explain how that happened? Because that's just so,
Sure.
so striking.
So Alicia Owens was indicted on 8 counts of perjury. And
so
because
lying.
She wouldn't recant accounts of her abuse.
Because she wouldn't recant.
She wouldn't recant.
So she basically spoke the truth, and afterwards she was pressured to change her testimony, and she refused to do that, so she was indicted on perjury.
She was indicted on 8 counts of perjury by the state grand jury and 8 counts of perjury by the federal grand jury. So she was looking at 200 years in prison. And she came forward when she was 20. She'd been trafficked in her early adolescence. And she was looking at 200 years, and she still refused to recant. And a kangaroo court sentenced her between 9 and 15 years in prison. And the authorities really tried to destroy her, because they put her in solitary confinement for 2 years, nearly 2 years. So she's an amazing example of the resiliency of the human spirit. But with the grand juries, there was a grand jury in Florida, a state grand jury in Florida, that found that Epstein hadn't abused a single child.
Right.
So these are I've given you 3 examples of grand juries that have been utterly corrupt. And unfortunately, we still have that system. I think Nigeria and the United States are the only countries that still have. It's one African country. Very few countries have the grand jury system anymore, because it's just so flawed and so corrupt.
Yeah, so Yes, is there anything about the Franklin case that you feel is important that people know?
Well, with the Franklin case, you've got the federal government covering up child trafficking. And it's very much like with Epstein.
I just want to notice that, just the whistling is the fireplace, the wind. It's very windy, and it's just going into the fireplace, into the vents. So we may have some whistling in our sounds.
There's many similarities between the Franklin network and the Epstein network. As I said earlier, in D.C., with the Franklin network, there was the other pimp. His name was Craig Spence, and he was a CIA asset. And he had a beautiful mansion in Washington, D.C., and it was wired for audiovisual blackmail. And that's where the parties would go down. Much like Epstein, I believe that Epstein is an intelligence asset too. And all of his homes are wired for audiovisual blackmail. So there's a lot of crossover between the Franklin scandal and also the Epstein scandal.
So was it natural for you to, because you, when did you first work around the Epstein case? Because he was obviously indicted in 2009. Did you know of him before then?
No, actually he was indicted earlier.
Oh.
What happened with the Epstein case is a 14-year-old girl told her mother what had happened.
Yeah.
And her mother brought her to the Palm Beach Police Department. And the girl was from a lower socioeconomic background, and she described the exterior of Epstein's home, the interior of Epstein's home, and also his anatomy. And the Palm Beach Police Department then pursued Epstein very clandestinely for about a year. They investigated Jeffrey Epstein for about a year. And they knew of 17 underage victims, but they had 4, or actually 5 go on record. They initially wanted to indict Jeffrey Epstein on 5 counts of unlawful sexual activity with a minor and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation. And that case got taken away from them and was given to one of those corrupt grand juries. And Lana Bell-Lavick was the special prosecutor of that grand jury. And she only called 2 of the victims. Now, and I think law enforcement knew of anywhere from 17 to 23 victims at that point.
When we're talking about these victims, these are all local minors above the age of 12, correct?
Yes, yeah.
So nobody that was trafficked by him from other countries and so forth, and younger children. These are all local girls in Florida.
And the youngest one we know about in Florida is 13.
Gotcha.
So the Palm Beach Police Department, the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department is a really good, solid guy. His name is Michael Ryder, and he's the real unsung hero with the Epstein case, because he pursued Epstein, and there were a lot of threats. There was a lot of pressure put on him not to pursue Epstein, but he pursued Epstein nonetheless. And Joe Riccieri, who was the lead detective, they were both relentless. And they ultimately had Epstein on unlawful sexual activity with 4 minors and 1 count of lewd and lascivious molestation.
What year was that?
That was 2006.
Okay.
So they were going to arrest him straight out, and then the state of Florida took that case away from them and gave it to a grand jury. And as I said, the special prosecutor of the grand jury was Lana Bell-Lavick. And she only called 2 victims of Epstein's. One victim she had been 14 when she was molested by Epstein. She was now 16. And one victim had been molested by Epstein multiple times when she was 16. She was now 18. And she just skewered these poor girls. She just skewered them. And actually the grand jurors at a certain point are calling them prostitutes. And it was just horrific what they did to those two girls, just horrific. So that grand jury didn't indict Jeffrey Epstein on a single count of child molestation. It indicted him on one count of adult solicitation. That was it. Now, Michael Ryder got very vociferous.
Solicitation as if those girls were adults.
The whole thing was screwy because there weren't any adults called that had been solicited by Jeffrey Epstein.
Right.
There were two underage girls. So, I mean, that just shows you how corrupt that grand jury was. But Michael Ryder, the chief of the Palm Beach Police Department, he would not back down. He went to the Department of Justice and he said, you guys have got to do something about this. He called that grand jury one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in modern history. So Alexander Acosta was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District, which is Palm Beach and Miami. And they impaneled a grand jury. And ultimately, that grand jury and the FBI agents found a number of victims. Actually, they had a list of 36 victims, but they knew of 40 victims. And they were going to indict Jeffrey Epstein on 60 counts. And one of those counts, I think it was count 51, was child trafficking, which in the federal system, that's a heavy sentence. That's 15 to life. So those 60 counts probably would have put Jeffrey Epstein away for the rest of his life. But Alexander Acosta was pressured to drop the Epstein investigation. There's only two people constitutionally in the country that can tell a U.S. attorney to stand down. One is the Attorney General and one is the President. Alexander Acosta by himself as a U.S. attorney isn't going to go out on a limb and cover up a nationwide or international child trafficking network. He's just not going to do it.
Was it already clear that it was international? So we're talking 60 known victims and all of, we're not talking about...
It was 60 count indictment, but they knew of 40 victims.
40 victims, but are we still talking about teenagers from Florida, or was it already going into other states?
I think at that point they knew there was interstate trafficking.
Interstate.
So that and that's a federal sentence. So Alexander Acosta ultimately stood down and didn't prosecute Jeffrey Epstein. And as I said, there's only two people that can tell Alexander Acosta to stand down. One was Alberto Gonzales, who was the Attorney General under Bush. But an Attorney General isn't going to go out on a limb and cover up a nationwide child trafficking network unless his boss tells him to. And his boss was George W. Bush, Bush II. So that's where that cover emanated from. And I didn't know this until this latest tranche of documents, but Acosta didn't want to do it. I thought Acosta folded immediately, but actually there were quote-unquote top brass from the FBI that went down to Florida to light up Alexander Acosta and to edify him about dropping the case.
Okay. Well, were you writing about the case at the time?
No, I was, at that time, I was writing the Franklin scandal. I'd heard a little bit about Epstein, but I was so transfixed on getting the Franklin scandal written because it's a big book. It's a
big book, and it's a really good book, and you really start to feel the reality. You know, you start to feel into the reality of what really happens when powerful people are protected.
So the Franklin scandal came out in 2009, 2010, and no one bought it. I spent 7 years of my life on that book, and nobody bought it.
Well, you didn't get platformed.
So I lost a lot because of that book. And it was a very difficult time for me.
Well, I hope it's selling now because it really is.
Actually, it's selling better now than it's ever sold before.
Yeah.
So, but I decided to look at Epstein because there were accounts of various girls getting molested by Jeffrey Epstein, and then that grand jury saying that he hadn't molested a single girl. So I was thinking there might be another Franklin. So I went down there, and I didn't have a lot of money, and I just.
You did go to Florida.
I had to go to Florida. I just had to. I was dealing with a lot of despondency in my life because I'd lost a lot, but I just had to go down to Florida and investigate. So I got down to Florida and I started pounding the pavement and knocking on doors and doing the things that I do. And I ended up with this black book. And this is October.
Can you just talk about a little bit how that came about?
I ultimately talked to a lawyer for a couple of the victims. And he was like the first person I talked to. I gave him a copy of the Franklin Scandal. I don't know if you ever read it. But I think that he could see I was doing the right thing. And then he ultimately gave me the black book.
But the origin was the black book was originally stolen by.
Yes. The black book was originally stolen by Alfredo Rodriguez, who was the house manager.
And it's, just to be clear, if anybody doesn't know, it's the address book of Jeffrey Epstein.
Yes, it had all his. But then Alfredo Rodriguez circled a bunch of names who he said were in pedophilic.
He said were involved.
Yeah.
In the trafficking.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I got that, and then I started to call the victims first. I wanted to see what was up. The first conversation I had with the victim was very strange because I was talking to her mother, and she was in the same room, and her mother was asking her the questions that I was asking her mother, and then she would respond to her mother, and then her mother would tell me the answers. And she had been molested by Jeffrey Epstein initially when she was 13 years old. And I could tell that this had been very damaging to her. But in investigations like this, you've got to go to people and say, tell me your darkest nightmares. I mean, that's the only way that you're going to excavate truth. And it's hard. It's really hard.
Well, it requires a certain sensitivity, certainly, and it's never helpful to have a parent in between.
Well, that was the only way I was going to be able to communicate with her. So that I was cool with that. But then when I realized that she was 13, because the media was trying to sell that these were girls who were older. Yeah. And the 14-year-old was an anomaly, but I would find out that that's not true. And then I called up someone who talked to me about being flown to an island. And I eventually got the story of all these girls going on planes, being trafficked.
So you put the black book online. You did that in 2015, correct?
Yeah, I got it in October of 2011.
Okay.
And no one wanted to touch it. I pitched it and pitched it and pitched it, but nobody wanted to touch it. So it just was gathering dust in a corner of my desk. And I was wondering if I was ever going to get it published. And then in 2014, I got the flight logs too.
You did?
Yeah. So I had the book and the flight logs. And then Gawker said that they would publish it.
Gotcha.
And that's how that went down.
So from the investigation that you did, were you aware, because of course, as you know, I work with survivors of extreme abuse all the time. And so we're talking what I call the network, which is basically this mafia that is hogging the control power of much of the Western world, but that is then organized at the highest levels and branching down. But the child trafficking and the darker things that happen, you know, we all know are part of that. And so in that respect, I've personally spoken to several survivors of Epstein. And one of those people that, okay, it's somebody who told me, but she was a baby when he owned her and trained her. And she was in a family, she was placed in a family in New York, but I think she came from Kosovo. She looks Eastern European, but I believe I've heard Whitney Webb saying that he was going to the orphanages in Kosovo around the time of the war, and then brought back the little orphans, and then she was placed in a Titanic family in New York City, so he had access all the time. And then he trained her and she called him Daddy, and he, as far as I understand, he was a programmer. And all the people that I've spoken to that were abused by him were much younger than in their teens.
With Epstein, I knew that girls were younger than 12. And I also knew that some of those pedophiles were very sadistic. But no one wanted to listen to me, because I was the only one that was saying it, that girls were younger than 12 and some of these pedophiles were very sadistic. And people just didn't want to hear that. Now there's this tranche of documents that have come out, and it shows that there were girls younger than 12. And it shows that there was extreme sadism too. There's actually an email that's sent to Jeffrey Epstein about a torture video, and Jeffrey Epstein sends the email back. I loved the torture video. And torture doesn't just come up once, it comes up a number of times.
And that's one email that is not coded.
So with those documents, they're corroborating what I have said for quite some time. And with Epstein, we're really beginning to see how evil he was.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the following, that, you know, even though a lot of people are now understanding that it's so much worse than what people believed before. Of course, I have been speaking out since 2013 about my extreme abuse as a child in this organized way. Others have as well, for decades even. People were speaking out in the 80s, you know, and they had some audience, you know, there were people that were listening then, but then there were always these extremely large movements to either discredit them or just like change everything, like the false memory movement, for example, that suddenly went after the ID and had again, the media jumping on board and many scientists jumping on board to make this real, when, you know, in fact, it's maybe of course that can happen, but it would be quite rare, that kind of situation where therapists would force memories or would, you know, suggest memories to vulnerable patients. That's rare. So the fact that this came under fire and that all survivors now became ridiculed and not believed, that was like a whole cultural change there, you know, and that was the 90s, really.
The False Memory Syndrome Foundation, you didn't have to dig very deep to see how pathological it was, but it had tremendous power. Frontline did 2 pieces extolling the virtues of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The New Yorker published an article extolling the virtues of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation was founded by Pamela and Peter Fried, who were husband and wife and also brother and sister.
Yeah, they were step siblings.
And Peter Fried was a mathematician. He had a PhD in mathematics. he was molesting his daughter, Jennifer, and then Ralph Underwager signed on, and he is on record saying that something like 80% of women that were molested as children found it to be a positive experience. So you had three highly...
For a pedophile magazine.
Yes. And so you had three very pathological personalities that came together with the False Memory Syndrome Foundation, and they got tremendous traction.
Yes, the daughter of Peter Fried, by the way, who as an adult daughter, Jennifer Fried, privately accused their father of molesting her, and then the parents were the ones that made it public.
Yes.
In their defense, and then made it so big. But the fact that it got traction can only mean that, you know, I say agenda that gets pushed, that is convenient at that time and was necessary, together, of course, with Elizabeth Loftus, who became the main scientist there.
And Orrin had been affiliated with CIA mind control, and so had Johnny Blast.
Who's that?
Martin Orrin was part of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation.
Okay.
And he'd been part of the CIA mind control.
I see.
And I think Jolly West was too, and he'd also been part of the CIA mind control.
Yeah.
So
But it did change the culture through the media alone, because in fact the false memory syndrome was never recognized even by...
No.
Yeah, as a syndrome.
The false memory syndrome was never recognized by the DSM-4 or DSM-5, which is the Bible of psychiatry. But dissociative amnesia is recognized, and also dissociative identity disorder is recognized. So, but yet they still had this tremendous traction.
But it also, what was happening at the time was that you would find, you know, every TV show, every movie would have a situation where a man was falsely accused. And the stories were, you know, made so that the victim then recanted and we're so sorry, and they give them some reasons and everything. And, you know, they really changed the focus of the worst thing that can happen to you is being abused as a child sexually, to the worst thing that can happen to any person is a man whose reputation is harmed by a false accusation.
Yeah, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation flipped it.
Yeah.
And actually, although the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was a joke, it really was.
Yeah.
And it's since disintegrated.
Yeah, but it's
It's left an indelible imprint on child abuse, unfortunately.
It's being used. It's getting new life in Europe now, where the media is really using false memory syndrome again. But it's always connected to people speaking out about satanic abuse, because in the 80s there were people speaking out about satanic ritual abuse, and then we had the satanic panic, and in response to that we had false memory that kind of threw all survivors of sexual abuse under the bus. And in Europe now, people are starting to speak out about satanic abuse, and of course we're talking about VIP, high-profile perpetrator satanic abuse, and now it's being used in Europe as well. And I just wanted to mention it because it just really changed the culture, and it really affected people believing, survivors obviously, and then you know, what do you think is happening now with the Epstein files, really? Because what we're getting is there's a lot of information, but no one's going to jail, or no one's been tried and sentenced.
With the Epstein files, there's disinformation, there's misinformation, and then there are just documents that are dripping evil. And at this point, Mark Tramo, who was a neuroscientist at UCLA, he wrote an email to Epstein talking about how to make a baby, enhance an infant's sucking ability.
Yes.
And he's no longer with UCLA. They've taken him off. There was Martin Nowak, who was a gifted scientist, mathematician at Harvard, and he had an email exchange with Epstein about torture, and he's taken a leave.
Was taking a leave, and the other one got fired. Yeah, it's not really quite.
No, we need more. Well, Les Wexner lied to the Oversight Committee. He said that he stopped dealing with Jeffrey Epstein in 2006. We've got emails in 2008 between them, but then Jeffrey Epstein gave him $56 million in 2011.
Jeffrey Epstein gave Les Wexner $56 million?
$56 million.
Wow.
So, and we can prove that. That was in the New York Times. So, why isn't Les Wexner being indicted for perjury? That's a heavy sentence. That's 5 years. To lie before Congress is, to perjure yourself before Congress is 5 years. So,
proven, already proven.
So, we have to, our government has done everything it can to cover up Jeffrey Epstein. Mm-hmm. And it's just not Democrats, it's just not Republicans. The cover-up started with Bush 2, it went through Obama, and then it went through Trump, and then it went through Biden, and now there's traction. But it was a Pandora's box. And Bush 2 built the Pandora's box, and the Obama administration had the good sense not to crack it open, and Trump did initially. And
why do you say had the good sense?
Because they knew that it was a Pandora's box, and if they cracked it open, they would release the curse of Jeffrey Epstein. So Trump didn't either.
Well, the curse of Jeffrey Epstein is that so many people are involved that are in government.
Yes.
And on the highest levels.
Yes. So when I'm saying good sense, I'm talking about good sense from a
ironically
political view.
Right.
So Trump thought that he could crack open Pandora's box ever so slightly and then slam it shut.
Because of pressure.
Because of pressure.
Because he wanted to move on.
But regardless of how little you open Pandora's box,
it's a Pandora's box.
The curse comes out. So now the curse is out.
Yes, I've noticed, and a lot of people finding me, realizing that what I've been saying is true, and I'm sure you've had the same.
Yeah.
Would you talk a little bit about Epstein justice?
Well, Epstein justice, I've been appalled by the lack of justice with the Epstein case. And about 3 years ago...
Long before the files came out.
Long before the files came out. Because I knew how evil Epstein was. I knew that these girls were being served to sadistic pedophiles. I knew that some of these girls were under 12 years old. And nothing was being done about that. So I decided that somebody had to do something about it. So I started a nonprofit organization, a 501c3. And our goal is to get, what we ultimately want is an independent congressional commission. Independent congressional commissions don't require the signature of the president. They just need a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate. And they often farm out investigations to non-government personnel. And that's the only way we're going to get truth with the Jeffrey Epstein affair, is non-government personnel investigating it. And that independent congressional commission that has non-government personnel investigating would have two objectives. One, we'd want to know why the government covered up child trafficking. When you cover up a crime, you're aiding and abetting that crime. So essentially, we want to know why the government is aiding and abetting child trafficking. And two, we want the perpetrators to be prosecuted. Baseline morality. And that's what Epstein justice is about. And it's a slog. We're not being embraced by billionaires or even millionaires. But it's attracted a lot of good people. I'm very fortunate about that.
And I've heard you say one of the things that you do is to publish the names when a bill comes forward, and it's one of those clear-cut bills where you have to be a pedophile or aiding and abetting a pedophile to support the bill, like, for example, the release of the Epstein files. Then you release the names of all the people who are voting with the pedophiles. So is that...
But what we do is we have a legislator of the week, and we try to get them to, because we need a majority in the House and a majority in the Senate to get the Independent Congressional Commission. So we've been having a legislator of the week that we encourage people to call and email. And now we're comment bombing politicians on Instagram. So it's, what we're doing is very grassroots. And it's very difficult. But I put so many years into this. What else am I going to do? I mean, I could work in a parking lot. I mean, or become a certified certified accountant. I mean, what else am I supposed to do? So I've been at this for so many years, and I've written so much about it that there's no U-turn for me. There's no existential U-turn. I mean, this is my path. For better, for worse, and sickness and in health, this is my path.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you, because that kind of integrity, you know, that when you have a mainstream career, you're obviously gifted when you were working in that field. The choices that you make, you know, when you're going after truth, and particularly this truth, it costs you, and it's cost you personally, I'm sure. And I want to thank you, you know, because I'm a survivor, and we need people like you to have the integrity and the courage to stand up for what is right, and to do something to expose, and, you know, in a way that it can enter back into the mainstream, that people can understand. But you can't do it any other way than grassroots, because I'm like you say, no billionaire or even a millionaire is coming close to you, because it has to remain grassroots, because that's where the truth is. Anything else is bought and sold. No.
It's been very difficult, but
yeah,
we've got a very committed crew. And actually, Alicia Owen, the girl that did 2 years in solitary that was sentenced to 15 years.
The survivor.
She's an associate director.
All right.
At Epstein Justice. So I think that we've got really good people, and we keep making strides forward. I had never started a nonprofit organization. I was just a writer. I'd been a writer for over 30 years. And that's what I was used to. So when we started this, we had no idea of what we were doing. We knew we wanted an independent congressional commission, but other than that, we had no idea of how we were going to get there. But now we have a pretty cogent plan, and we just need more people to sign on with us.
Yeah, so what do you need from people? What do you need from our audience?
We need, okay, so we're setting up Facebook groups by state.
Okay.
And we need people to join these Facebook groups.
Nobody's on Facebook anymore.
So, well, you'd be surprised.
Okay.
And
older people.
These Facebook groups are going to put pressure on the respective legislators of that state. The Facebook groups are by state. So, and we're also doing comment bombing on Instagram too. But ultimately, we need federal legislators, and the only way that the federal legislators are going to vote for an independent congressional commission is if there's pressure, if there's fear.
Now, an independent congressional commission, how would you put that together? How would that work? Because we you know, as you said, grand juries, those are people from the public, but they're very corrupt. So how do you put together a commission that would not be corrupt?
Well, it would have to hire non-government personnel, like someone like me. That's the only way. And that's, if this just went to a subcommittee, it would die.
Okay.
What we want to do with an independent congressional commission is take this out of the political process.
So like I could be on that commission as well?
Yes, we would take this out of the, and that's the only way we're going to be able to take this issue out of the political process, is an independent congressional commission.
Yes, and then it would have to also get mainstream attention, because a commission without coverage is rather useless too.
Well, I think that we're going to have a lot of fanfare even before the commission.
Gotcha.
The fanfare will lead to the commission. And it's not going to be easy, and some people think I'm delusionally optimistic, but I've never been diagnosed delusional. I am optimistic, but I've never been diagnosed as delusional. No,
I think it's a very good... I was skeptical at first, I should admit, when you first started this. When was it, a year and a half, 2 years ago?
About 3 years ago.
Oh, okay. So I was a little skeptical at first, but it sounds reasonable anyway.
Well, now we have webinars, and we've got a petition with like 85,000 signatures. We've got thousands of people in our email database. We're growing.
Okay.
I mean, but no one's given us a check and said, and someone came up to me a while back and said, well, why do you need money? And because of what we're doing, our accounting has to be pristine. So we've hired a professional accountant. When I pay her, I don't ask her, well, why do you need the money? So, and when I pay people that work for us, I don't ask them, well, why do you need the money? And I've been fortunate, I don't really need a lot of money. I've got different tributaries coming in financially for me. I don't make a lot, right, but like royalties and stuff like that, but I make enough to get by. So I don't really have to pull money out of Epstein Justice.
Yeah, I think that transparency about financials is actually super important anyway.
Yeah. For
anybody, you know, that's how you know where someone stands. And the not needing a whole lot of money is very important because it's the biggest it's the biggest temptation used by the network, as I call it, to get people corrupted.
Well, I mean, we're incorruptible.
Yeah.
We are. I mean, I'm not going to corrupt the organization. And the people that are with me are not going to corrupt the organization.
Well, that's really good to hear.
But, you know, on the other hand, because of that inability to compromise our values, it's harder for us to get money, I think.
Of course it is. Absolutely, I know that. Yeah, so... Well, is there anything that you would like to say before we close that you feel is important that maybe we didn't address?
No. I think that we did pretty good. I think we covered just about all the bases. I think it's important that people know that you need to be financed, and Epstein Justice needs to be financed. And these are both important for our society. And the thing about it is, with Epstein Justice and with Epstein, we are seeing a level of corruption that we've never seen before. Mm-hmm. This is much more corrupt.
It's very in your face, too.
Yeah, much more corrupt than Watergate. And I think that this is going to be the best opportunity in our lifetimes, and maybe ever, to really clean our government out. Because there's a lot of people that are compromised in our government. And this is going to be our best opportunity. The middle class is disintegrating, and that's what made America so strong, is we had a very robust middle class. And that is disintegrating. And the reason why it's disintegrating is because our politicians are making laws that enable that disintegration. So this might be the best chance in our lifetimes or ever to stop our politicians taking us off a cliff.
Yeah, well, thanks for doing what you do. And again, I keep, from reading your book and this sort of exhaustive, account, really, it's very well written, not from that, but the forces to stop the truth from coming out and from getting justice, that is what is exhaustive. It's again and again and again. And again, the victims are blamed. And in this case, the victims were sent to prison for perjury. And she did that in the face of 200 years and then ended up in solitary confinement. So, what a hero. But at every step of the way, to me, it's just so clear what is happening that I was always stunned that through the Dutroux case as well, that people actually believed, they created this believers and disbelievers. The disbelievers were the so-called skeptics, but they were skeptical again towards the victims, towards the survivors. And the believers were the so-called naive believers. And I always thought it was really crazy that, no, the disbelievers, the skeptics, are following the authorities, are following the government. And the government who benefits, who benefits more? The survivors that are risking everything to come forward, or the perpetrators that have a reputation to uphold? I mean, who benefits more?
I will say one thing about Belgium. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Belgians hit the streets.
Yes, because there were 4. You see, what happened in Belgium is, it's important to talk about, because they were finding bodies of children, and 2 girls were rescued from the dungeons of Marc Dutroux. And at that point, everybody agreed that this is a VIP network in Belgium, and things are going well. And the original investigator was very strong, and he said, I'm gonna get to the bottom, I promise you, I'm gonna get to the bottom of this. Well, it was when he was removed from so there were 2 girls, young girls, saved from the dungeons of Marc Dutroux, and 4 dead bodies of little girls. So it was very big news. It was not just in Belgium, it was all over the world. It was in the New York Times. And then this investigator got thrown off the case. And everybody knew that it was a move, that it was sabotage. And so the white marches, as they were called, people were feeling everything from the dead children. And they were saying, this is crazy, this is corrupt. But what happened then, after the white marches, 8 years later, by the time Marc Dutroux went to trial, everything was suppressed again. And I felt it when I would go back to Belgium. It was like a heavy blanket of denial. People went back to the ones that had been marching, were disillusioned, hopeless, feeling powerless and dejected. And everybody else, it was so hidden that young people don't even know about the Dutroux case in Belgium. And of course, in the trial, only Marc Dutroux really got sentenced, and then Michel Nihoul, who was there for taking part in these kidnappings. That Marc Dutroux is not really the Belgian Epstein, but anyway, he gets called that because he was the front person in it. But Michel Nihoul, who had a much bigger role, and who I came across when I was being trafficked in that network, Michel Nihoul, he was sentenced by a majority of the jury, deemed him guilty for these kidnappings. But it wasn't a great enough majority, which meant that the judge had to decide. And the judge decided he was not guilty for this. And he ended up spending less than 2 years in prison for unrelated charges.
I think that Epstein can be the Dutroux of the U.S. There's 3 trends that are preventing, I think, Americans from a white march. The right and the left have been heavily polarized. People on the right think that people on the left are mentally ill, and people on the left think that people on the right are mentally ill. So they don't realize this, but they've been divided and conquered. The left and the right have been divided and conquered. Now, this is an issue that the right and left can agree upon, probably the only one, that children shouldn't be molested with impunity and that the government shouldn't aid and abet child trafficking. I mean, that's something that most of us can agree on. Yeah. The next trend is Americans have been conditioned to believe that they cannot affect change. And that is something that is with us. Many people have just given up. They're alienated. And then you superimpose a very corrupt, compromised political system on those 3 trends, and then you end up where we are now. But I think that the right and the left can come together on this. I think that it's going to be slow, but I think that people will eventually realize they can affect change. And by the time we get to voting for independent congressional commission, we're going to know who's compromised and who's not.
Well, it's becoming increasingly clear who's compromised just because of where you stand on this issue.
Yes, but a lot of Americans haven't embraced that yet. When you've got a pathology, when you've got a disease, there's 3 phases. There's awareness, there's acceptance, and there's action. Now, everybody has awareness of Epstein at this point. And I think that this latest tranche of documents is giving a lot of people acceptance about how evil it was. So once we hit that critical mass of acceptance, then we'll see a sea change into action. And I believe that that can happen. I believe that action can happen. Again, I might be delusional, but I've never been diagnosed as delusional. I think we might be done.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.